The asphalt at Jerez does not forgive. It never has. This particular ribbon of tarmac, coiled through the Andalusian hills like a serpent that has outlasted every rider who ever dared to disrespect it, has consumed legends, dismantled dynasties, and rewritten careers in the space of a single heartbeat. Sunday delivered yet another sacrifice to its altar, and the man prostrated in the gravel was not some journeyman finding his ceiling. It was the most decorated, most dissected, most psychologically complex competitor this sport has ever manufactured. Marc Marquez down again, at a venue where 5 victories are permanently etched into the record books under his name. 2 laps, that is the grotesque arithmetic of it, not deep into a race where fatigue accumulates and judgment erodes, not during a desperate late race gamble when championship pressure distorts perception. 2 laps. The motorcycle was not being flogged beyond the absolute boundary of mechanical possibility. The physics were not being violated. And yet there he was, the 8-time world champion, horizontal, watching his Spanish Grand Prix dissolve into gravel and humiliation while the rest of the field thundered past. What makes this particular fall so uniquely unsettling is not the crash itself. Crashes are the punctuation marks of MotoGP. Every rider falls. The sport is essentially an extended negotiation between human ambition and the immovable laws of friction and gravity. What separates this incident from routine attrition is the portrait it paints when held up against the light. Because when Marc Marquez crashes in a manner that does not even resemble Marc Marquez, this paddock does not engage in quiet conversation. It erupts. The confession hidden inside a victory speech. Here is where the narrative fractures into something genuinely sinister. Alex Marquez, your 2026 Jerez race winner, the man who has now claimed back-to-back victories at the same circuit, the younger brother who was not supposed to be a championship contender according to virtually every pre-weekend projection, sat in front of the cameras after collecting his trophy, and delivered a sentence that should have detonated inside every boardroom at Ducati headquarters. He said, calmly and without theatrical embellishment, that his brother had been surrendering time through left-hand corners, not in qualifying, not during a specific sector under unusual conditions, from the very opening moments of free practice, from lap 1 of the entire weekend. If you are approaching MotoGP casually, that observation might register as mildly interesting technical detail. If you understand the anatomical biography of Marc Marquez's career, the documented, thoroughly examined, brutally honest map of where his body has been broken and where it has been forged, that sentence lands like a structural diagnosis revealing cracks in a load-bearing wall. The right side of Marc Marquez is mythology built on suffering. The 2020 Jerez catastrophe, a first-lap crash that shattered his humerus and set off a cascade of surgical interventions, complications, psychological warfare, and physical reconstruction spanning years, transformed the right side of his body into a landscape of titanium, scar tissue, and hard-won compensation. Every serious analyst, every rival team, every engineer who has ever studied his telemetry understands that the right side represents his documented, acknowledged vulnerability. It is the side where he has had to adapt, compensate, and occasionally concede. The left side is where Marc Marquez commits murder. That is not hyperbole. That is a factual description of the mechanism through which he has historically separated himself from competition that, on paper, should be capable of matching him. The left side is where he generates the fractions of a second that accumulate into race-winning advantages. It is where he loads the front tire with an aggression that other riders cannot replicate, where he manufactures corner entry speed that belongs to a different category of physical and mechanical understanding. The left side is the foundation upon which his supremacy was constructed. So when his own brother, a man with intimate knowledge of both his strengths and his limitations, a man who trains alongside him and understands his physical condition better than any journalist or analyst, volunteers without prompting that the left side is bleeding time, the implications cascade outward in every direction. The shoulder that remembered nothing. The surgery last autumn, that is the ghost haunting everything. Nobody in the paddock wants to articulate it with directness. Marc himself orbits the subject rather than landing on it. His vocabulary gravitates toward front feeling, a phrase that sounds like a setup complaint, a tire observation, an engineering challenge. Francesco Bagnaia, separated from him by a garage partition and a very different set of weekend results, uses almost identical language independently. Front feeling, front communication. The nose of the Ducati GP26 arriving at corners with a question that neither rider currently possesses the complete answer to. For Bagnaia, this is a motorcycle problem. For Marc Marquez, this is a motorcycle problem compounded by something more intimate and more troubling. Because the instrument through which a MotoGP rider interprets front-end communication is not a sensor or a data logger. It is the human body. Specifically in this context, it is the nervous system operating through a shoulder joint that was reconstructed several months ago and has not yet fully recovered its former authority. The Ducati GP26 demands an extreme level of commitment at the front contact patch. It asks its riders to arrive at corners with a willingness to accept feedback through the handlebars at forces and frequencies that would terrify any sensible human being. For Marc Marquez at full physical capacity, this conversation between man and machine has historically been conducted in a language that feels almost supernatural in its fluency. He does not merely survive the front-end loading, he weaponizes it, extracting information and pace from moments where other riders are purely focused on not crashing. At Jerez last Sunday, the surgery had altered the conversation, not eliminated it, not catastrophically disrupted it, but introduced a hesitation, a momentary grammatical pause in the dialogue between his reconstructed shoulder and the front tire. At a circuit that demands absolute unconditional faith through sequences of left-right combinations requiring total weight transfer commitment, that hesitation manifested as something devastating. 10% doubt where he previously operated from a foundation of absolute certainty. In MotoGP, 10% doubt at 300 km per hour does not produce a slightly slower lap time. It rewrites the entire risk calculus. It shifts the threshold between controlled aggression and uncontrolled consequence. It transforms a lap that should have been a demonstration of dominance into a lap that ended with helmets scraping tarmac and a championship campaign absorbing yet another catastrophic wound. The arithmetic of a coiled spring. Now we must do something that requires more courage than most coverage of this sport is willing to summon. We must engage honestly with the mathematics of what has actually occurred across 5 rounds of the 2026 MotoGP season. Marc Marquez, 57 points, 5th in the championship, 2 DNFs on his record, a 4th-place finish in Brazil, a 5th in Austin achieved despite absorbing a long lap penalty that extracted a genuinely disproportionate cost relative to the infringement it was meant to punish. And now, 0 points from his home Grand Prix at a circuit where his name appears 5 times in the winner's archive. On its surface, this portrait looks like disintegration. It looks like a narrative of decline, of a reconstructed body failing to meet the demands of the pinnacle of motorsport, of a legend being systematically dismantled by the combination of physical limitation and accumulated misfortune. Look deeper. Highland, a circuit configuration that exists almost tailor-made for Marquez's specific strengths, smooth asphalt, flowing technical geometry, extended power sections where his mastery of the Ducati's engine characteristics should translate into something close to inevitable superiority. The absolute minimum expected result from a Marc operating at anything approaching full health. 2nd place, 20 points absorbed into the championship tally. Those 20 points did not arrive. They evaporated before the season had properly oriented itself. Attach those 20 theoretical points to his current 57, 77. Now return to Jerez, not to victory. We are not constructing optimistic fantasy. What represents the absolute floor, the worst-case scenario outcome for a Marc Marquez at this circuit with his front feeling restored, with his left side operating without physical betrayal, with his shoulder communicating rather than hesitating? A podium, 3rd place, 20 points at absolute minimum. Add those 20 points to 77. 97 points. Marco Bezzecchi leads the 2026 MotoGP World Championship tonight with 101 points. Read that sequence again with full attention to its implications. The gap between the current championship leader and Marc Marquez, after 2 DNFs, after a long lap penalty that cost him a potential podium, after a surgical recovery that has measurably compromised his performance at specific corners on specific circuits, after a weekend at his own cathedral where his biological weapon failed him, that gap is 4 points. 4 points separated by nothing more extraordinary than 2 catastrophic weekends being replaced by 2 competent ones. This is not a championship in terminal decline. This is not a season slipping irreversibly beyond reach. This is a compressed steel spring under extraordinary mechanical tension, waiting for the conditions that allow it to release. What the Monday test means for everything. The Jerez circuit does not empty on Sunday evening. Monday morning brings something potentially more consequential than the race itself. A test session in which Marc Marquez will not be attempting to be the fastest man on track. He will not be chasing lap records or trying to overpower his limitations through sheer will and accumulated racing intelligence. He will be doing something far more sophisticated and far more important. He will be performing diagnostic surgery on himself. Every data analyst in the Ducati garage, every tire technician studying compound degradation curves, every engineer who spent the race weekend watching telemetry channels that don't appear on broadcast graphics, all of them arrive Monday morning with a single priority that supersedes development, supersedes lap time optimization, supersedes everything else on the test program agenda. They need to find the millimeters, not the centimeters of raw pace, not the wholesale performance gains that a new aerodynamic package or revised chassis geometry might deliver. They need to find the precise location along the left-hand corner entry sequence where front communication transitions from clarity into ambiguity, where Marc's reconstructed shoulder loses the conversation with the contact patch, where the hesitation that costs him tenths, and that ultimately cost him the race, originates. There are two possible outcomes from Monday's session, and crucially, both of them are valuable. The first outcome: they identify the specific mechanical and physical variables contributing to the front feeling deficit. They develop adjustments to the GP26's setup that reduce the communication demands on his shoulder without surrendering overall performance, and they begin a process of incremental restoration that allows Marc to extract progressively more from his left side advantage as the season advances. The second outcome: the diagnostic process reveals that the 2026 iteration of Marc Marquez requires a fundamentally different architecture of machine behavior to express his particular style of riding at full intensity, that the GP26 as currently configured is asking questions his post-surgical body cannot yet answer with its historical authority, and that a more substantial engineering intervention is necessary. Both outcomes constitute critical intelligence. The worst scenario is not identifying a problem that requires significant work. The worst scenario is misreading the symptoms, applying superficial solutions, and arriving at the next round having addressed nothing fundamental. The shadow falling on Bezzecchi. Marco Bezzecchi deserves to have his achievement acknowledged with the seriousness it warrants. 8 race victories in 2026, 101 championship points, a lead constructed through genuine pace, genuine racecraft, and a composure that has not wavered under consistent pressure. The Aprilia RSGP has proven itself capable of competing at the absolute frontier of the sport, and Bezzecchi has maximized its potential in a manner that commands professional respect. But tonight, in whatever private space elite athletes occupy when the cameras have departed and the debrief conversations have concluded, there is a specific calculation running inside Bezzecchi's awareness. Because the most dangerous version of Marc Marquez is not the one that destroys you with overwhelming pace. It is not the one that outqualifies the field and disappears into a lead that nobody can close. The most dangerous version is the wounded version. The version that has been knocked down, embarrassed, statistically disadvantaged, and publicly questioned, and that emerges from all of it with the specific, quiet, surgical focus that only arrives when survival instinct and competitive obsession converge in the same human nervous system. Bezzecchi currently operates with clear air ahead, no presence in his mirrors that demands psychological attention. No Marc Marquez colonizing the peripheral spaces of his awareness during corner entry, occupying the mental bandwidth that should be devoted to optimal execution. Aprilia's machine performs at its best when the road ahead is uncontested, when the pace it naturally possesses can be expressed without the specific type of pressure that Marc generates, not merely from proximity, but from the particular gravitational weight his reputation carries into every wheel-to-wheel confrontation. The psychological dimension of Marc Marquez as an opponent has never been adequately quantified in any data system any team operates. It exists in the tenths that appear in rivals' lap times when he closes to within striking distance. It exists in the slightly late breaking point that arrives when the number 93 machine fills a competitor's mirror. It exists in the corners entered too conservatively when aggression was required, because something in the competitor's subconscious has registered the proximity of a man who has broken his opposition more thoroughly through psychological means than through mechanical advantage. Bezzecchi has never had to endure a full championship campaign with a healthy, motivated, precisely focused Marc Marquez hunting him from behind. Everything that has happened this season, every DNF, every penalty, every physical complication has functioned as an invisible shield, protecting the Aprilia rider from confronting that particular category of pressure. That shield is temporary. The other Marquez problem. There is an additional dimension to Sunday's results that complicates the championship mathematics further. Alex Marquez, winner of the 2026 Spanish Grand Prix, back-to-back victor at this circuit, currently sits 7th in the standings with 53 points, 4 points behind his brother. The younger Marquez arrived at Jerez having failed to penetrate the top 5 in 3 consecutive rounds. His own pre-weekend assessment dismissed podium contention as unrealistic. No credible pre-race analysis positioned him as a genuine victory threat. And then he led from the front, managed the gap with the assurance of a rider operating several levels above his publicly projected ceiling, and crossed the finish line first in a manner that generated one of the season's most extraordinary storylines. More extraordinary, and more consequential for the broader competitive landscape, was what followed. Francesco Bagnaia, world champion factory team leader, the most successful Ducati rider in the company's MotoGP history, stood in front of cameras and publicly stated that his factory operation needed to study and replicate the approach being demonstrated by a customer team running what is theoretically a less privileged version of the same motorcycle. When the most decorated constructor in contemporary MotoGP instructs its flagship operation to imitate a satellite team, the diplomatic vocabulary surrounding that statement cannot soften what it actually represents. That is not a technical recommendation. That is a structural crisis being communicated through the formal politeness that professional motorsport demands in public settings. 2 brothers, 1 trophy, 1 pile of gravel, 4 championship points separating them, and between them they have exposed every fault line running beneath the surface of the 2026 season. The long road ahead. 57 points, 5th in the championship. The casual headline suggests a rider at the margins of relevance, accumulating damage faster than progress, watching his final opportunity for a 9th world title recede toward the horizon. The reality is a story of violent compression. Every missed point, every zero on the results board, every race weekend where his physical limitations betrayed him at the precise moment where his strength should have been decisive, all of it has accumulated not into irreversible distance but into potential energy, into momentum waiting for the conditions that will allow it to express itself. The 2026 MotoGP season has a long, demanding road ahead. The circuits that remain on the calendar include venues that historically speak to Marc Marquez's specific strengths, tracks where his command of front-end loading and his capacity for surgical aggression in fast corners have historically translated into the kind of results that reshape championship standings in a single afternoon. Tomorrow morning, he will roll out of the Jerez pit lane carrying the weight of every surgery, every scar tissue layer, every comeback from every category of damage this sport has inflicted on his body across 17 years of professional racing. He will not be the fastest. He will not be attempting to be the fastest. He will be precise, relentless, and honest with the data in a way that only becomes possible when a rider has experienced the full spectrum of what this sport can do to a human being and emerged still willing to have the conversation. 4 points from the championship lead, 2 DNFs removed from mathematical contention, a loaded mechanism under accumulated tension sitting in an unlocked room with the entire second half of the season still unwritten. This is not a crisis, this is the beginning of a reckoning. The most dangerous version of Marc Marquez that has ever existed is not the one celebrating in victory lane. It is the one arriving at the Monday test with a purpose that goes beyond lap times, beyond setup sheets, beyond anything that appears in the official technical debrief documents. It is the one who understands with absolute clarity exactly how close everything still is, and exactly how much further damage he is willing to absorb before he is finished.